Hello, everybody. Greetings from the IEA, and welcome to those of you joining us from around the world. My name is Michael Waldron, and I will be moderating this third session of the World Energy Outlook Week. During the first 2 days, we heard very good, excellent discussions around the prospects for transforming the energy system to keep the door open to a net zero emissions by 2050 trajectory. We also heard yesterday a discussion on the implications for energy security and the potential associated volatility depending on the speed and orderliness of these transitions. Today, we're going to start to drill down into some of the sectoral stories that we have in the scenarios. We're going to discuss today the transitions in the electricity sector. As we highlighted in the WEO this year, accelerating the decarbonization of power is the single most important way over the next decade to close the ambition gap that would help to put the world on the pathway to reach net zero emissions by 2050. We observe that key parts of energy demand are increasingly becoming electrified, as we see with the rapid growth of sales for electric vehicles, as well as electrification of buildings, heating, and some industrial processes. In an increasingly complex energy system, electricity system flexibility is increasingly central to energy security, and these security aspects also include the resilience of power systems in the face of growing climate risks. Transitioning the electricity sector in a secure and sustainable manner will require a heightened focus on policies as well as finance, the two big topics of today, to scale up renewables and other clean power sources, as well as to roll out smarter, more flexible infrastructure. It also requires addressing a current major source of global emissions, and that is the existing coal power fleet. To unpack these issues, we're first going to hear a presentation from my colleague Brent Warner, who's the head of the power sector unit at IEA. And then following Brent's presentation, we are going to hear from our four distinguished panelists to continue the discussion. And I'm going to introduce them very briefly here and have them say hello. The first will be Alfredo Parres. He's a senior vice president, industry network leader for renewables at Hitachi ABB Power Grids. Alberto drives Hitachi ABB Power Grids global strategy and sales in the renewables segment. And then Annie Balabanyan is a practice manager of energy and extractives in the Global Knowledge and Expertise Unit in the Infrastructure Vice Presidency of the World Bank. Annie leads the practice's program of global analytical work and oversees the provision of global technical expertise in support of the bank's operational engagement across all regions.
Good afternoon.
Then we have Mr. Pramudaya, who's the sub-coordinator of power system planning from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources in Indonesia.
Hello, good evening from Jakarta. Thank you.
And we also have Enrique Dallas Morenas, head of competitor intelligence, market studies, and strategic analysis from the Global Power Generation at Enel. Enrique has been responsible for the intelligence unit within Enel Green Power since 2019.
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to share this afternoon with you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much to our panelists. And now I'm going to turn it over to Brent to present some of the findings from this year's World Energy Outlook.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you to our panelists for joining us today. And again, today we're focusing on the electricity sector transitions and particularly on financing as well. So I would like to just take the next 10, 12 minutes to highlight some key aspects from the World Energy Outlook 2021 and the projections related to the electricity sector. To get right into it, first we would have the fact that an overview, we look at the overview of the generation mix by source here, looking over where we're starting from and what we see over the next decade. So first, we're taking stock of where we stand globally. There are some very important points. We've seen, of course, in 2020, the global pandemic has had a major effect on the energy system at large, and electricity is no different. Renewables were the only source of electricity to grow in 2020, and that squeezed fossil fuels, coal and natural gas in particular. But still, we stand at a point where unabated coal-fired generation is the largest source of electricity in the world today, far exceeding that from natural gas, which is the second largest source. Renewables are on the rise, 30% of generation in 2020, and fossil fuels have fallen to 61% of generation in 2020, which is the lowest level for 3 decades. So this is good news, this kind of moving snapshot of where we stand, but we clearly see that there's a lot that needs to happen in the electricity sector. And so we'll talk a bit about that from the generation mix, also in terms of overall emissions, and then on investment needs. So first, in the announced pledges scenario over the next decade, so this is where we take account of all the pledges that have been made, the commitments, the policies in place, looking forward as they relate to electricity, and of course, the scenario includes the energy sector at large, is already driving a major transition. Renewables become the foundation of power systems worldwide. You see the very strong growth here for wind and solar PV generation over the next decade. That's onshore wind, offshore wind, large-scale solar PV and small-scale solar PV, all contributing to this growth. We have policy support in over 130 countries worldwide. The very low technology costs for those are driving massive growth and reshaping the electricity sector. And in fact, over the next decade, wind and solar PV are able to keep pace with electricity demand overall, which increases by about 30% from 2020 to 2030 because of electrification, because of economic growth, and also because the initial growth of hydrogen production from electrolysis. Now, we still see, though, that unabated coal-fired generation is still quite large, and in fact still remains the largest source of electricity even in 2030. And that already signals how much further we need to go to get on a track towards net zero emissions by 2050, where in fact electricity becomes the first sector to be net zero, which is by 2040. So we're looking here, we need unabated coal-fired generation to fall rapidly. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But this is mainly through accelerating that deployment of wind and solar PV. Over the last decade, wind and solar annual additions have quadrupled, and we need that to happen again over the next decade, so reaching 1,000 gigawatts added in 2030 alone to get on this pathway, to transfer to a net zero emissions pathway. What does that mean in terms of overall emissions? If we think about the electricity sector, we often think of a relatively low emission source. We hear about decarbonization, we hear about renewables, but it's worth noting that in 2020, the electricity sector is actually the largest emitting sector in the world at just over 12 gigatons, representing over a third, about 36% of global energy related emissions. And in fact, they have been on the rise when you look over the past 2 decades, plateauing in recent years. And so this really needs to be the point where we change this trajectory going forward, rather than what we saw a few years ago. Before Paris, the baseline was for emissions to continue growing, for the carbon intensity of electricity generation to only fall slightly towards about 420 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. There you see on the right in 2050, which is still above the best gas-fired generation. We need that. We're seeing that picture has changed a lot in the last 5 years, and also in the recent pledges heading into COP26 at Glasgow, where in fact those emission intensities will fall quite dramatically, and we would turn the corner and start seeing emissions from electricity falling quite rapidly, and that opens up these broader emission reductions through electrification. But of course, we need to go much further than that when moving towards net zero emissions in the electricity sector by 2040. We need to accelerate those reductions, and that creates actually a very large ambition gap that we've highlighted in the World Energy Outlook 2021 in 2030. In fact, the ambition gap is the largest in the electricity sector out of any, and this is because we have the technologies, we know how to do this, they're low cost, but we need to accelerate the reductions going to 2030 and certainly beyond. And there's very good news in our analysis as well that, in fact, a huge portion of those reductions, those emission reductions, can be cost effective. We can do this without raising the cost to consumers. Making the transitions affordable for all citizens around the world is a critical aspect of secure and reliable and achievable transitions. So we estimate about 60% of the additional wind and solar PV, hydropower expansion in developing economies, as well as some nuclear power expansion and lifetime extensions, are cost-effective measures that could cut the gap by 60% going forward. And that's a critical point from the analysis, and I think for the greater discussion about how the transitions can be accelerated. To focus a minute on coal, we've shown that, or we've seen over the last decades that in fact, we've actually been building more new coal-fired power plants every decade up until the current one. We've seen in the last decade, more than 700 gigawatts were added. That's well in excess of the previous decade and more before that. And that means we have a very large existing fleet. We need to, that in 2020 emitted 10 gigatons, the largest single source of energy-related emissions. And that's one piece of the puzzle. We first, in order to tackle coal-fired emissions, is to stop building new unabated coal-fired power plants. And there's good news here in that under announced pledges, there will be a sharp reduction in the pace of new coal plant additions. We have 140 gigawatts already under construction today. There's 3 times that much in the planning phases. So those plants that are planned to be built, we need to address that. And in recent weeks, we heard an announcement from China about stopping and ending support for projects abroad, for new coal projects abroad. We estimated the impact that could have. That could cancel as much as 190 gigawatts of those planned projects, effectively making the next decade the last one where we see new unabated coal-fired power plants. To give you an idea of the scale, this could save up to 20 gigatons over the next 30 years. It's the equivalent of the European Union going to net zero emissions by 2050. So a very large, important announcement. And we look for more of these announcements coming in the lead up to COP26 and at COP26 itself. So that second point, though, on the existing plants. So we need to stop building new, but we also need to address the existing fleet. To give you an idea of how pressing this is, the 2,100 gigawatts of coal plants, they'll operate for decades to come. If we continue to use them the way we have in the past, they alone would eat up half of the remaining CO2 emissions budget to limiting global climate change to 1.5 degrees. So clearly this is unacceptable in our strive to address climate change. And thankfully there are measures that can be taken to address the existing fleet. We can retrofit them with carbon capture and storage. You can repurpose them to run less, focus on flexibility and adequacy. You can also co-fire them with biomass or low carbon ammonia. And where we can, where the security of supply can be maintained, we can also retire them. So in the announced pledges scenario, you can see that we actually save 100 gigatons of emissions over the next few decades, which is 20% of the remaining CO2 budget. This is a key area that we need to act going forward. To the investment side, focusing first on power plants, I would just point to the fact that we need to scale up the investment quite dramatically. If we look at decade-long averages here, the next decade needs to be at least 50% higher investment in power plants to fulfill announced pledges, and moving to significantly more than that, much more than double, almost triple the level to follow a net zero emissions by 2050 pathway. And that's predominantly scaling up wind and solar, but you can see is also scaling up other low emission sources, investment in low emission sources, from hydropower to geothermal to concentrating solar power, also hydrogen, ammonia, and carbon capture and storage. And this is the global picture. And of course, there's a regional aspect that underpins all of our work. And we need to be looking at those where this kind of investment, where this scale up needs to take place. Now, clearly, advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies all need to partake and all need to step up action here. This is not something that 1 or 2 countries can do alone, but requires collective concerted action. But we also see that in emerging market and developing economies, the need to scale up investment is significantly higher. the difference between the announced pledges and net zero pathways are significant, more than double the amount of investment needed over the next decade. And that will call on the international finance community to play a role here to make sure that funding is available. And we've done work on this, Mike Waldron as well, leading much of this on financing these transitions. We shouldn't forget grids in any of this. They need to walk hand in hand with the expansion on the power generation side. So in the same way, we need to scale up the investment in grids. They are the backbone of electricity systems. They support the effective integration of renewables and the overall security of supply. Now, the key drivers of that increased investment stem from increased demand is actually the primary driver for the need for grids to expand and also to be modernized, but also this renewables expansion, connecting new power plants, new wind and solar projects, for example, but also reinforcing the grids, modernizing them, digitalizing them, and making sure that the grids are able to support and advance those clean energy transitions. We also, of course, cannot forget the existing grids that are there. They've been built over the last century and more, and we need to maintain and upgrade that infrastructure to make sure the system is as efficient and effective as possible. And that takes, we highlight this here because it takes coordinated planning between the generation expansion and the grid expansion. In many cases, you're talking about a decade-long permitting and construction process for grids, which is far longer than many of the resources on the generation side. And then to close, I think this is to underscore the new challenges that we are going to face related to electricity security. So we're talking about systems where we have much more variable renewables coming into the system, much more wind and solar. We often talk about that, but I wanted to give a chance to give a little bit of a view here on that. We think of it through phases of integration, which indicate and help prioritize the actions needed to incorporate and effectively integrate these renewables. So on the left-hand side, you have a few typical days within the European Union in 2020, where wind and solar PV are a minority of electricity supply. So electricity demand is the line above. And that means, and today already we're in phase 3 in the European Union, so of around 30% of generation. So where you're already needing to have dedicated flexibility investment in all measures, but that's quickly changing. By 2030, typical day, you have wind and solar representing the majority or a significant portion of electricity demand. And by 2050, you'll be moving into higher phases where wind and solar PV regularly exceed overall electricity demand. And it's about effectively integrating those with systems we're calling for storage, smart grids, digitalization, demand side response. All of these measures will be needed. And this will be new territory that we haven't yet experienced. And it's not just in Europe. This is also the case in China, as well as India, the United States, which we continue to model in great detail. But this will be a worldwide phenomenon that we will need to push forward and address in order to make sure that electricity is reliable, secure, and affordable as we go forward. So with that, I would hand the floor back to Mike and look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brent, for that clear and comprehensive presentation. Let's go right into the discussion with the panelists. We have about a little over 40 minutes to exchange on these ideas. It's very clear that dramatic changes are needed in the generation mix, as well as the correspondent system flexibility to help integrate these new technologies. I'm going to turn first to Alfredo, and I'm going to start with an area that oftentimes does not get sufficient attention, as Brent noted in his presentation, and this is the electricity network. Modern digital electricity grids are the cornerstone to support the uptake of increased amounts of variable renewables. They're a crucial source of power system flexibility and high renewable systems, as well as electricity security. Yet we've seen in recent years that investment in networks has remained relatively stable. So from your perspective, what are some of the key factors that would help to drive a dramatic increase in investments we need to see, particularly under the net zero emissions scenario?
Thank you very much, Brent, for the question. And as Michael said clearly, electricity will be the backbone of a power system, no? And that's the environment in which we are moving. investment in grids are needed, as it was said, mainly driven by increasing electricity demand, as you are projecting in your work. Grids are needed to collect the power from where generation takes place. And in this new world, generation will take place where the resource is, when the wind is blowing, where the sun is shining, and where water is flowing. So collect that power and transport it through this energy infrastructure will be, that's where we'll need it to make the investment. But also to keep the system at check, to keep the balance, no? And that's where interconnectors come to play. And we had just the powering of the last one in Europe with the Nord Link between Germany and Norway, bringing the hydropower of Norway to the south and the offshore wind power from Germany to the north. What's good in this situation is that I personally think that awareness is created, not the least because of the work that IEA is doing, no? Where you send a clear message, no? That we need early action as a time to develop grids. It's much longer than the one needed to build a new generation. So early action is not needed to avoid creating bottlenecks in the system. We've seen also President Biden has been very vocal when he talks about the need to upgrade the US electricity infrastructure to meet the country energy or sustainability targets. So my personal experience, which is also very encouraging, is to see how public servants talk about grids in a much more educated way. So a lot has been done in terms of awareness and education. So that's definitely a strong place to start. So what needs to be done? I think Michael referred also to that, no? 2 levels. Work on existing grids and work on new grids. And I want to start with the upgrade of existing infrastructure for a very good and simple reason. I always say it's a no regret measure to invest in existing grids. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about investing to get the maximum capacity of the existing infrastructure, or we increase the amount of electrons that flow across the wires, or we increase the capacity of this infrastructure. These upgrades also include the upgrade of assets that have aged, that are becoming older. So brings a huge benefit in terms of lack of no needs of complex permitting and social acceptance is less of a problem. Those technologies to make those upgrades exist already. So these grid upgrades are really a no-brainer, a no-regret option. And the enablers for that is to make sure the financing is there, the regulatory environment is there. So supporting total expense, not only the capex, but also the operation expenses, and give the possibility for the investors to choose the best option. When it comes to new lines, we talk about infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, and interconnectors. Here, planning is everything. Plan upfront to be able to develop this infrastructure. And SOE and SOGAS in Europe have shown the way. They've announced a draft of the 10-year development plan, the 2022 TYNDP, so-called, and they've incorporated in their assumptions the 2030 55% greenhouse gas emission reduction and the net zero scenario. So incorporating these midterm, long-term scenarios in our planning is absolutely key. And we see this happening also in other countries. So it's key. We need a vision where infrastructure and our renewables ambition are combined. We need planning for new build and upgrades, and we need the right regulation and remuneration schemas in place.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. I wanted to pick up a bit on this planning aspect and this kind of long-term vision. I'm going to turn to the colleague from Indonesia, Mr. Pramudaya. And Indonesia, of course, is a country that relies quite heavily on existing coal power and thermal power, but yet in its most latest 10-year power development plan, it foresees that 50%, some half of the planned additions this decade are going to come from renewables. Of course, that is an important vision to help to get the market going. But how would you see this evolving in the Indonesian context? What are the types of policies and approaches that Indonesia is putting in place to help realize this vision?
Okay, thank you for the question. Currently, more than 60% of our electricity generation is coming from coal. But with the new policy of Indonesia government, in order to reduce the CO2 emission, lower than the national determined contribution of Paris Agreement, there is no additional plan for the new coal-fired power plants in PLN Power Development Plan for the next decade, which is endorsed by Minister at the end of last month. The plants that still exist, the coal-fired power plant that still exists in our PTL, is only for those that already signed off the power purchase agreement or PPA or the under construction projects. And then the energy transition in Indonesia now is starting in power sector, indicated by 52% of additional capacity in the power plant development plan is coming from renewables. And also to achieve the 23% of renewable in 2025, we will implement the biomass co-firing in the existing of coal-fired power plant as well. Furthermore, towards the net zero emission in 2060 or sooner, there is no fossil fuel power plant will be developed beyond 2030. There are some challenges in the transitioning of power sector. The first is how to improve the grid flexibility. Our utility and the APPs need a time to implementing the new grid code, especially regarding to activation of automatic generation control or load frequency control or free governor on the existing plants. The second challenge is we're facing the oversupply in major grid. We need to add more renewable plants in order to increase the share of renewable in energy mix. But the situation is that the major grids like Java, Bali, and Sumatra estimated will be oversupply for the next decade if we add too much plant in the grid, because a lot of ongoing projects will be come into the grid for the next 2 years. Then we will relocate some existing plant to outside Java, Bali to reduce the oversupply. And then the third challenge is the take or pay term in the PPA with the IPPs. When the VRE come into the grid, then the will be impact to the capacity factor of the base load power plant, like coal-fired power plant. Then will be decreased below the availability factor, which agreed in the PPA. So the PLN should pay some money to the IPP if the capacity factor is below the availability factor. And then the last challenge is our utility or PLN asset revaluation. In order to obtain the financing for the 35 gigawatt programs in the 2015, PLN doing the asset revaluation. So the lifetime of entire power plants belong to PLN was extended to 30 until 40 years. Means that like coal-fired, the lifetime will extend to 2045 to 2055. Then if the plant retired before the lifetime, there is a financial impact to PLN balance sheet and finally impact to the debt to equity ratio. That's the major challenge for energy transition in Indonesia, especially in the power sector. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think in the next round of questions, we'll try to come back a bit to some of the specific risks of investing in the Indonesian context. But for now, I'd like to turn to Annie, and I'd like to turn to this topic of coal, the coal power, that is. And we also heard from the Indonesian colleague some of the implications for existing generators from shifting the generation mix more towards renewables and some of the ways that Indonesia is addressing this. Of course, as Brent noted in his presentation, the policies when it comes to coal power really shift to how to manage that existing fleet. And there was a recent commentary issued by the IEA executive director and the World Bank president jointly, where they talked about the role of blended finance and other mechanisms from development finance institutions. Can you help us understand a bit better what the World Bank is doing, what other development finance institutions can do to better help this transition away from existing coal?
Okay. Yes. Right now.
That was a question for Annie from the World Bank. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Thanks. So maybe I'll start by, explaining a bit why we do see the transition away from coal, indeed a development finance institution issue. And for that, let me quote a few statistics, to explain the rationale and then explain the approach we're taking. So, and it was actually also Brent's presentation today. So overall, there is still a very big fleet of coal-fired power plants, I think around 2,150 gigawatts. And what's important to note that, while the average economic life of a coal-fired power plant is about 40 years, about 60% of today's fleet is, either 20 years old or younger. And newer coal assets are actually concentrated largely in developing economies, mostly in Asia, and our Indonesian colleague already mentioned particular, issues they have in Indonesia. So, which means that if the existing fleet is, left to retire by the end of its economic life, and I think Brent also highlighted this in his presentation, that will consume a very big chunk of remaining global carbon budget. So, and the alternative is to basically support that about 1 trillion of coal-fired power plant assets, which would be at risk of being stranded, that they will be managed properly, retired, and repurposed. So in our estimates, about 89% of that assets which are risking to be stranded are in the developing world. So as you can see, this is very much a development world issue, and therefore we do see an important role for development institutions like the World Bank to support countries in this transition. So, and I mean, also in IEA presentation today, it was very clear that, the transition has to have an unprecedented scale and scope. So that explains that there really needs to be blending of concessional and climate finance to truly accelerate the transition. So, the way we see the role of the concessional financing and climate financing, it has to be obviously very strategic and targeted, but it does have an important role together with the upstream support, that institutions like us provide for the overall policy regulatory framework in terms of, basically offering various blended finance instruments, which can in turn also crowd in a significant private capital. In terms of how the bank approaches the issue of what we call actually just transition away from coal, we see this as a whole of a society approach. And we actually do have about 3 decades of experience, already, mostly focused on actually mining side. And we're building on this, and, the way we work, it's at 3 levels, at national, regional, as well as we work with local authorities. And we basically support a comprehensive approach whereby we help build governance structures, we support engagement and welfare of impacted workers and communities. And we also help remediate and repurpose, both the mining lands. In the case of, coal-fired power plants, also we try to explore various options of their repurposing. So this is actually, despite our decades of work, this is also a work that keeps evolving. We learn from our past experiences, and we try, based on that learning, to improve our approach. And, particularly in terms of how we address social and environmental impacts of transition and support communities' participation in the overall decision-making process. So
Great.
This is briefly kind of about our approach and how we see this issue.
Just a very quick follow-up to that. Can you give us a sense of the timescales involved in this engagement? It doesn't sound like something that can be done in a few years, but it sounds like a very long-term process. And are there any good examples the World Bank has worked on around the world that you would point to in terms of a successful transition from coal power?
Yes, as I said, actually, we have engaged quite a bit already in the past. I think most of our past engagements, which have been in the past predominantly focused on mine closure, have been actually in Eastern Europe, and they included, for example, engagements in Ukraine, Russia, Western Balkans, Poland. it is indeed a long process. It takes, good amount of time to plan properly, to consult. Actually, the actual closure typically takes much shorter, but then it takes quite a bit of time then to, basically repurpose, or, in the case of land, to, to help it develop it to alternative uses. So overall, I think based on our experience in the past, this can easily take 10 to 15 years to do it properly. So therefore, yes, action needs to be taken right away, and and proper planning is really, really instrumental to ensure that the process is smooth. So that this is an inclusive process, and that it takes care of the local communities that would be impacted by the transition.
Great. Thank you for those insights. I wanted to shift a bit and go towards the developer perspective and all this in terms of developing the renewables, the generation projects, which are really needed to shift the power mix. And so a question to Enrique, when you're looking at what power sector developers can be doing better in terms of addressing some of the cost issues or the technology uptake issues that Brent cited, or where you're looking to governments to put in place the conditions that would help to better support investment in renewables and other sources of clean power, what comes to your mind? What would be priorities from your perspective?
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for the question. Actually, I would make I would separate, because I believe that there are two very different realities. One is in developing countries, where I would say that from the developer perspective, we are reaching a point where saturation of renewables is creating some social unrest and is creating a lot of difficulties in what regards the permitting process. And here we need governments to make sure that they put in place measures to bring renewables closer to the population, to soften some of the environmental rules, or make them more explicit and clearer, so that there is clear perspective from the beginning. And I would say that in addition to the permitting issue, which is a very relevant issue, there's also a need to go hand in hand with the grid planning process. We are reaching in the developing world many bottlenecks in terms of distribution and in terms of networks that are no longer capable of providing access to all the renewables that we want to deploy. And at this point, it is very necessary to have the government planning the reinforcements of the grid in a way that significantly help guide promoters and developers, so to make a better job in developing the new renewables. So I think those are probably the most important things that we need to address in most of the developed countries. Whereas in developing countries, here I will try to close the loop with what you already commented about coal. Demand is growing in the developing countries, and LCOEs of renewables are much higher than current costs of existing fuel-based technologies. So there is a gap that needs to be bridged. And high LCOEs are a result of, I would say, mainly financing costs that the financial world assigns to developing countries. And probably the other component is the lack of infrastructure. So every time we as developers go to a developing country and try to put in place new renewables, we find that we need to add an extra cost to make up for the lacking infrastructure that will connect you to the consumption of the electricity. So both components make that LCOEs in developing countries are excessively high. And we as a world have not come up with a scheme to help developing countries bridge both problems that they have, so to really be in a situation to reinforce development in those countries. So I would say that those are the major issues that we are facing.
Great, thank you very much for those insights. I'd like to expand a bit more on this notion of the cost of capital, of the cost of financing, bring the discussion back to some of the developments we need to see in emerging market and developing economies. So I'm going to turn to Mr. Pramudaya from Indonesia in 1 second. But I would note that in some of the work we've done in the World Energy Outlook, we see the LCOE for new utility scale solar PV and wind as being lower than other sources of new generation, lower than new coal or new gas power in a number of markets around the world. But the condition is that you need to have good financing costs that are supported by remuneration mechanisms that help to reduce that cost of finance. So Mr. Pramudaya, turning to the Indonesia context, we know that the cost of capital tends to be elevated for investing in power projects. There's a number of risks. Some of those are related to the presence of the infrastructure related to the planning, but also the risks associated with the power purchase and the negotiation of PPAs. Based on your previous answer, you kind of sketched out some of the big moving pieces in Indonesia's transition, but can you talk to us a bit more about some of the more specific policies or ways in which Indonesia working with the international community can help to address some of these risks faced by investors in renewable power projects?
Okay. Yes, to minimize the financial risk for the country or for PLN, for our utility, the government will take the risk. Means that if the cost of renewable rising, the generation cost of PLN, our utility, then the government will give some compensation to PLN. Then to minimize the financial risk, government encouraged to prioritize the least cost of renewable, like solar PV. Yeah, of course, we take into account the great ability to receive the BRE integration. Yeah, as we are aware that the variable renewable energy costs like solar PV tend to decrease rapidly, especially for PV. Yeah. The latest our market sounding in Indonesia last year saw us that the LCOE of solar PV decreased from almost 6 cents per kilowatt hour, $6 per kilowatt hour at the latest PPA in 2019, decreased to below 4 cents per kilowatt hour with the last year market sounding. Yeah, we hope the same trend with the wind as well. So the total cost of our generation will be decreased. I think that's also our policy for the next to achieve implementing of the renewable in the power development plan. The government will issue some policy to avoid the risk of our utility. Thank you.
Great. Just a quick follow-up question on that. Are there efforts within the Indonesian context for the kind of energy policy making as well as the financial policy makers to work a bit more closely to make available lower cost financing in terms of lower cost loans or concessional funds to developers?
Yeah, we help the lender give the lowest country risk. Yeah, so the cost of money will be decreased, and then the LCOE will be decreased as well. Okay.
I'd like to sort of continue on this topic, but maybe turn to Annie to get a wider perspective from some of the World Bank's activities in emerging and developing economies. And we note that provision of capital, low-cost capital in the form of blended finance instruments is very instrumental. But this oftentimes works best when it's paired with kind of capacity building, technical assistance to aid the implementation of policies which are needed to reduce the risks, not just to address them using financial mechanisms. So can you talk to us sort of broadly, but also highlighting any specific examples you'd like to how the development finance institutions can better deploy blended capital as well as technical assistance programs to help scale up renewables, other power system investments, and any sort of lessons learned that you could highlight in terms of the how to get these investments done in newer markets around the world.
Thanks. Sure. So I think, indeed, this is, the blended finance alone is not sufficient. So I think, the way we approach this is really through a comprehensive support, which involves, several important elements. And I think some of it also were featured in today's presentation, and some of the other panelists raised it over and over. So one is planning, obviously. And good planning is very important, and many of our countries in developing world really, do not have good institutional capacity for this. So this has been always our focus, but lately more so in terms of helping them develop, detailed low carbon development pathways for the energy sector. So the second important element is the whole upstream, of course, framework, which comes to policies and regulations. Obviously many countries still face high fossil fuel subsidies. They also, lack adequate systems for, tariff setting, for essentially attracting investments. So the overall, policy regulatory framework is another important area where we focus. And of course, carbon pricing as well. So that's the second block, probably. I think another very important area, which was highlighted today as well, is about network infrastructure. This somewhat gets overlooked oftentimes, in the energy transition, but it is absolutely critical, and probably one area where oftentimes concessional finance is important to enable at least private investments in the upstream generation. So, it's been always about, 1/3 of our lending historically has gone to network infrastructure, and we do expect this to remain or even grow. And this is, about strengthening both the transmission and the distribution grid, both for, expanding universal access, which still remains as a development institution, very important area for making this process also inclusive, as well as for, digitalizing the network, allowing it to, integrate the variable renewable energy. So in this context, we also kind of very much focus on regional integration. I think this is another important area where you can, bring both resilience and also enable a larger integration of variable renewable energy. And maybe another important area is the whole, area where we engage on improving performance of utilities, which are usually off-takers also of the renewable energy. So basically, the way we approach it, it's kind of not one size fits all. I mean, obviously, even our development countries are on very different pathways across the globe. So our approach is, you probably know, we have the so-called maximizing finance for development approach, whereby we very strategically only use the concessional financing for climate finance. And the way we approach it in every country context is to see what are major barriers which are impeding private capital penetration, and somehow try to work with the governments. And I highlighted a few areas where we do see often barriers to remove them. So kind of, we really try to be strategic in terms of where concessional finance makes sense, but it kind of, and systematic, so that this can just help, leverage both public and private capital at scale going forward. In terms of, examples, we have many. I mean, I mentioned, for example, regional integration. This has become a very big part of the World Bank engagements. One particular maybe investment, which, engagement, which was quite interesting and innovative, was a development policy financing cooperation we did last year in Western Africa, actually focused on regional integration, which, unlike our past engagements, which were mostly financing simply the interconnectors, were actually helping countries establish the soft infrastructure, basically the whole contractual arrangements and utility performance improvement, because that's a big bottleneck. If they are not creditworthy, that hinders obviously the regional integration and trade. So we are very much also engaged in, many of the clean energy areas. Maybe some of the examples, perhaps many have heard about the Scaling Solar Initiative, which actually is an initiative which the World Bank promotes across our three institutions, World Bank that I represent, but also our private arm IFC and MIGA. And, one of the good examples, for example, is our engagement as part of that in Uzbekistan. So, which was a country up until, last few years, which didn't have much of track record in attracting private investments in general in the energy sector. So we helped actually with the very first competitive procurement of solar project, which turned out actually, even to our surprise, with very, very competitive prices of around 2.7 cents. So I think the way we see our role is to maybe help the countries with the first projects, with establishing a successful track record, which will be important then to unlock, private investments going forward. So let me stop if you want to elaborate on specific other parts. I mean, we have obviously many examples. We are a big institution working across the world, but I try to outline how we work and what are the principles of our engagement.
Great. Those are really good examples, and you gave us a lot of really good insights there, particularly around the notion that when you're looking at a new market or trying to introduce kind of a first-of-a-kind project in a new market, just putting in place that kind of robust procurement framework along with planning can attract investment interest rather quickly, even for a market which is maybe not on the radar screen of developers and investors today, as you highlighted with Uzbekistan. We're going to shift a bit over. I'd like to kind of get some of the industry perspectives back into the mix. And we heard a lot from Annie on the role of planning, and particularly related to the networks. And when we're looking at some of the issues faced by electricity networks, Alfredo, you gave us some very good insights in the first answer, but I wanted to unpack this a bit more with regards to some of the recent extreme weather events that we've had. Some of the risks being posed, some of the physical risks being posed by climate change to the energy system, and how you see the challenge of enhancing the resiliency of the electricity network to some of these extreme weather events going forward.
Thanks for the question. Indeed, we've seen how these extreme weather incidents have affected the infrastructure, whether it's grid or generation assets around us. So the evolution of climate makes the whole issue of managing assets, forecasting power, or planning generation much more complex. So the way I see this, I think this, in addition to the resilience aspect that you mentioned, the restoration aspect coming first. What do I mean with restoration? So I mean our capacity to restore service in a fast way. So that's the first measure I think we need to consider when we think about the future and how our system will address those climate events. When we talk about fast restoration, the first thing is fast diagnosis. So how are we able to quickly and accurately identify where the fault is, where the problems are as the events are occurring, those catastrophic events are occurring. And that talks about investing in instrumentation, digitalization. So it's an issue about investing in the energy infrastructure. The second aspect that needs to be implemented in terms of fast restoration is field service. How we bring to the place where the accident happened quickly and swiftly people to be able to resolve the problem that has happened. And that calls for sophisticated system to manage and address this issue in coordination with the police or firefighters. So this field service, dynamic field services is absolutely key, being fully digitalized also. The third aspect that needs to be mobilized is spare parts and spare assets. As these incidents happen in an unexpected place, we need to make sure that those spare parts and assets are pooled so that they can be flexibly and quickly made available at the place where the accident happened. And all these measures for quick restoration needs to be done keeping health and safety on check. So we're talking about bringing people, goods quickly in a place where a dramatic incident happened. So health and safety needs to be taken into account. So as you may understand, we're not talking about new things here, but about investing, implementing technologies that exist already. Back on your point on resilience, it's about how you manage your network in a smarter way. Incorporating those incidents in your management system, incorporating also the new assets that you're building in the system. Also, how you play with flexibility to increase resilience, whether it's dispatchable renewable plants, storage, or demand response, or reconfiguration of a network, automatic reconfiguration to be able to manage the power flow and bring it back to the users. but also to increase the resilience systems, increase its capacity to respond to the incidents, building black start capabilities in the system, or new restoration techniques that need to be developed. No? And again, keeping health and safety on check. And resilience is also built based on developing digitalization, as was mentioned several times. So I want to say that we see that this challenge coming, and there are a number of solutions that can be developed across the world to address those.
Great. Thank you very much for that very insightful answer. I wanted to go a bit further on this discussion and the remaining minutes we have. We just have about 5 minutes left. But on this discussion of integration and electricity system flexibility, and turning to Enrique, and thinking about some of the various parts of flexibility that we know will play a role in the clean energy transition for the power system. This includes grids, of course, but it also includes storage. It also includes the potential for developing dispatchable capacities based on low emission sources, as well as smarter, more connected demand side, so including demand response. We heard from Alfredo that we need a lot of investments, we need the necessary upgrades. But could you talk to us a bit about some of the policy framework, some of the regulatory signals that would be needed to attract investment into these sources of flexibility, and maybe also highlight some of the opportunities or some of the barriers that you see in different markets for flexibility from the industry perspective?
Right. Well, let me start with a recap, a little bit of the origin of flexibility that traditionally has been provided by fossil fuel generating sources. So flexibility in the past has been understood as something that came with the generation, and in many occasions it came for free. There was no need to, it wasn't a differential feature of energy. It just came with energy as it was produced with fossil fuel generation sources. So now that this is changing, and actually this didn't change at the time of introducing renewables, this is changing now. Why? Because in as much as fossil fuel generation coexisted with renewables, they continued supplying flexibility. The thing is now that they are starting to be dismantled. The coal generation is no longer going to produce, and gas will no longer stay there for 4,000 hours a year, but just for 800 hours a year producing. This changes the paradigm. It is no longer the generation technology that produces the flexibility, or it will not be the only one to produce flexibility in the system. And actually, flexibility for renewable generation has not been has not been required and has not been integrated into the planning of the systems. There are very few. We saw some initial auctions requiring storage solutions, such as in Portugal lately, but we have only seen a very few that are promoting renewables to provide flexibility, whereas we know that renewables can contribute significantly to flexibility in producing innovative ways of coupling, for instance, different technologies, wind with solar, solar with hydro, installing batteries, and for instance, hydrogen could be another source of flexibility. But the paradigm shift is that now flexibility has to be a much broader concept. It has to be applied to distribution, to networks as well, because they are key in providing this flexibility, as Alfredo mentioned, and also to the consumer. Consumer is a relevant part and will have a say in providing the flexibility. And as of today, has not been really in the picture to provide this flexibility. So when the question is, what should be the signals? What is the framework that may promote an integrated way of providing flexibility? And I'm referring to an integrated way because I believe that in as much as you put all the actors together in the same market and make them compete to provide the flexibility, we will come up with the most efficient choice of flexibility or provision supply of flexibility. So to me, the question is, how can the governments integrate the different actors in a single market that provides an economic value to the flexibility, which has not been in the past, and other than providing an economic value for the short term, how can this be planned for the future in a market mechanism? And we do have some examples around the world. We have seen, for instance, how batteries are developing in Australia due to the problems in the grid that they have, and how these batteries have come to solve part of the problem. Demand response in Australia has been a key answer to the problems with the grid as well. We have seen in the United States and Texas places where adding batteries to renewables has already become a very profitable solution to problems that we saw. But most of the frameworks do not enable be it the integration of the different suppliers of flexibility, or less so the provision of an economic value to this product of the flexibility. In Europe, for instance, we do have capacity mechanisms and tenders for capacity mechanisms that provide some of this flexibility, but unfortunately, few of them are capable of bringing together all the actors that would be in a situation to supply the flexibility. Indeed. I don't know if this answers the question, Farah.
Well, it does, and unfortunately, we've reached the end of the hour, so we're going to have to conclude on that. But it's clear that there's a lot more to unpack on this subject, as well as all the discussions we've had with the panelists. So I'd just like to thank you all for your great insights. Like to thank Brent for the excellent presentation, and I would just note that WEO Week will continue tomorrow. In tomorrow's session, it'll focus on sectoral transitions to new energy industries, which will look at changes to existing and emerging industries in the end use in the fuel supply sectors. So with that, I would thank you all for your attention, and I wish you all a good day.
Thank you very much.